My hands trembled as I stared at the bank statement, the numbers swimming before my eyes like a cruel mirage. Zero. My life savings account, built painstakingly over 30 years of careful budgeting and sacrifice, showed a balance of $0.00. There must be a mistake, I whispered to the empty kitchen, but even as the words left my lips, I knew better. The withdrawal had been made 3 days ago, $127,000 in a single transaction. My daughter Sarah's name was on the account as a co-signer, added years ago for emergencies. This hadn't been an emergency. This had been theft. The room spun around me as the reality sank in. That money represented decades of denying myself small luxuries, working overtime shifts at the hospital, clipping coupons, and saving every spare dollar for my retirement. Sarah knew how important that nest egg was to me. She'd heard me worry about it countless times, seen me check and recheck the balance. Yet she'd taken it all, without a single word to me. I confronted Richard first, my husband of 32 years, finding him in his study grading papers. "Did you know?" I demanded, throwing the bank statement onto his desk. His reaction told me everything, the guilty flush that crept up his neck, the way his eyes darted away from mine. "She needed it for the house renovation," he mumbled, not meeting my gaze. "She said she'd pay it back." "She said?" My voice rose to a pitch I didn't recognize. "You knew she stole my retirement money and you said nothing?" Richard's passive shrug felt like another betrayal. "She's our daughter, Margaret. She wouldn't have taken it if it wasn't important." The casual dismissal of my feelings, my financial security, and my trust hit harder than Sarah's theft. My own husband had been complicit in this violation, treating my life's work as expendable as long as it benefited our spoiled daughter. I stood there, surrounded by the debris of my faith in my family, realizing I was truly alone in this fight. The anger burned through my chest like acid, but beneath it was something colder and more determined. Over the next week, I watched Sarah with new eyes during her frequent visits to our house. She swept in with her designer handbags and expensive coffee, chattering about her renovation plans as if nothing had happened. She spoke about marble countertops and custom cabinetry with the casual entitlement of someone who had never struggled to save a dollar. I noticed how she barely looked at me anymore, addressing most of her conversation to her father. When I mentioned needing to cut back on groceries to stretch my pension, she didn't even pause in describing her new walk-in closet. The disconnect was staggering. She'd stolen my financial security to fund her luxury improvements, yet showed no awareness of the impact on my life. She'd grown comfortable in her selfishness, assuming her actions would have no consequences. Sarah had always been our golden child, the one who could do no wrong in Richard's eyes. She'd learned to take without asking, to assume her needs trumped everyone else's. But she'd made one crucial error. She'd underestimated her mother. Sitting in my garden that evening, surrounded by the roses I'd tended for decades, I realized that emotional outbursts would accomplish nothing. Sarah was skilled at deflecting confrontation, and Richard would side with her as he always had. If I wanted justice, I needed to be strategic. I began to inventory what I knew about Sarah's life, her weaknesses, her dependencies. She was house-proud to a fault, obsessed with maintaining the perfect image for her social circle. Her identity was built around being seen as successful, put together, enviable. That image required constant maintenance and significant financial resources. Sarah had always been careless with money, assuming there would always be more available when she needed it. She'd never learned to budget or plan ahead because she'd never had to, first with our support, then with her husband's generous income, and now with my stolen savings. But what if that safety net suddenly disappeared? What if the foundation of her carefully constructed life began to crumble? I opened a notebook and began to plan, my anger crystallizing into something far more dangerous. Cold, calculated determination. The next time Sarah visited, I made my first subtle move. She'd brought fabric samples for her new dining room curtains, spreading them across my kitchen table like a queen displaying her treasures. "I think this silk damask," she said, not asking for my opinion but expecting my admiration. "Expensive choice," I observed quietly. She laughed dismissively. Money isn't really an issue anymore, Mom. We're doing quite well. Are you? I asked, letting a note of genuine curiosity creep into my voice. That's wonderful, dear. I suppose you won't need to borrow any more money from us then. The slightest pause in her fabric arranging told me my words had hit their mark. What do you mean? Oh, nothing specific, I said, starting to clear away her samples with deliberate authority. I'm just glad to hear you're so financially secure. It's such a relief to know you won't need to rely on your parents' savings anymore. Sarah's hand stilled on the damask sample. For the first time in months, she was actually listening to me, trying to decipher the meaning behind my words. Good. Let her wonder. I began making discreet inquiries about Sarah's financial situation, starting with casual conversations with neighbors and friends. What I discovered was illuminating. Her husband Marcus had been passed over for a promotion 6 months ago. Their second mortgage had higher payments than I'd realized, and Sarah's spending had actually increased rather than decreased in recent months. My sister Helen, who worked at the bank, provided additional insights during our weekly coffee date. Sarah's been in quite a bit lately, she mentioned carefully. Large transactions, multiple account transfers. She seems stressed about something. I also learned that Sarah had been bragging to her book club about her renovation budget, inflating the numbers to impress her friends. The borrowed money had become their money, in her narrative, the theft transformed into successful financial management. But most interesting was what I discovered about her timeline. The contractors were scheduled to begin work in 3 weeks, and Sarah had already paid substantial deposits based on the assumption that my savings would continue to be available. She'd gambled everything on my continued passivity. She'd miscalculated badly. I started with small, untraceable actions. When Sarah mentioned her contractor would be calling to finalize the schedule, I happened to call him first, asking detailed questions about the project timeline and payment structure. I expressed concerns about potential delays and budget overruns, planting seeds of doubt about Sarah's financial reliability. I also began having quiet conversations with Marcus during family dinners, asking innocent questions about his work situation and expressing hope that he was feeling secure in his position. The stress in his responses told me their financial situation was more precarious than Sarah was admitting, even to herself. Most effectively, I started documenting everything. Every expenditure Sarah mentioned, every timeline she established, every assumption she'd made about continued access to resources that were no longer hers. I was building a comprehensive picture of her overextension, her reckless planning, and her complete dependence on money that had never actually belonged to her. The foundation of her grand plans was built on quicksand, and she had no idea how unstable the ground beneath her feet had become. Late at night, when Richard snored peacefully beside me, I lay awake wrestling with the magnitude of what my daughter had done. The money represented more than just financial security. It was my independence, my dignity, my ability to face my later years without being a burden to anyone. Sarah had stolen my peace of mind along with my savings. Every time I looked at my empty account balance, I felt the weight of potential poverty in my golden years. She'd robbed me of the confidence that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself, forcing me into a position of dependence I'd spent decades trying to avoid. But beneath the hurt was a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about respect, about teaching consequences, about reclaiming my power in a family that had forgotten I had any. Sarah needed to learn that actions have repercussions, that other people's security matters, and that her mother was not someone to be dismissed and discarded. I would not go quietly into financial vulnerability. I would not enable her selfishness by suffering in silence. The time for passive acceptance was over. The opportunity came when Sarah mentioned her contractor was being difficult about the payment schedule. He's demanding a larger deposit up front, she complained during Sunday dinner. Some nonsense about ensuring project liquidity. I hid my smile behind my wine glass. My conversation with him had clearly had the intended effect. He was now questioning her financial stability and requiring more security before proceeding. Sarah was annoyed by what she saw as unreasonable demands, not realizing that her credibility was already being questioned. That does sound unusual, I said sympathetically. Perhaps he's had problems with clients not paying their bills? Sarah's indignant response confirmed she had no idea that her own financial reputation was being called into question. She assumed the contractor's caution was random rather than a direct result of doubts I'd deliberately planted about her reliability. This small success gave me confidence. Sarah was more vulnerable than she realized, her grand plans dependent on the cooperation of people who were beginning to question her stability. She'd built her house of cards on shifting sand, and I'd just given it the first gentle push. My sister Helen called me on a Thursday morning, her voice carefully controlled. "Margaret, I need to tell you something, but you didn't hear it from me." She'd overheard Sarah on the phone at the bank, arguing with someone about a loan application that had been denied. She was furious, Helen whispered, kept saying there must be a mistake, that her financial position was solid. But from what I could see of her paperwork, she's extended far beyond her means. Helen had also noticed Sarah making frequent trips to different bank branches, always looking stressed and carrying thick folders of documents. "She's scrambling," Helen concluded. "Whatever she's trying to finance, she's hitting walls everywhere." This information was gold. Sarah's financial house of cards was collapsing faster than I'd anticipated, and she was growing desperate to find additional funding sources. Her confidence was becoming panic, though she was still hiding it well from the family. Having Helen as an unwitting ally in gathering intelligence was invaluable. I now had real-time updates on Sarah's financial desperation, allowing me to time my moves with precision. At the next family gathering, Sarah was in particularly fine form. She'd brought photos of her planned renovations on her tablet, swiping through images of luxury fixtures and high-end appliances with obvious pride. "The kitchen island alone is going to cost more than most people spend on an entire room," she boasted to her cousins. She spoke about money with casual arrogance, treating the stolen funds as validation of her success rather than evidence of her theft. "We're finally able to do everything we've always wanted," she announced, as if the money had materialized through her own hard work rather than my decades of sacrifice. The most galling moment came when she turned to me with condescending sweetness. "Mom, you should come see the house once we're done. It's going to be absolutely stunning. Maybe it will give you some ideas for updating this place." The implication that my modest home needed improvement, funded by money that rightfully belonged to me, was breathtaking in its audacity. But I simply smiled and nodded, letting her dig her hole deeper with every careless word. Her confidence was about to become her downfall. I decided to test Sarah's reaction to potential obstacles. During a casual conversation about her renovation timeline, I mentioned that I'd been reading about construction delays and cost overruns in the local paper. "So many projects going over budget these days," I mused. "I hope you've planned for contingencies." Sarah's dismissive wave was telling. "We've got everything covered," she said with the breezy confidence of someone who'd never actually managed a complex project. "Marcus handles all the financial planning." But when I pressed gently about what would happen if unexpected costs arose, I saw the first crack in her composure. She grew slightly defensive, insisting that wouldn't happen because they'd done their research. The underlying tension in her voice suggested she knew she was walking a financial tightrope. I also casually mentioned that I'd heard some contractors were requiring larger deposits due to economic uncertainty. Sarah's sharp look told me this was hitting close to home. She was already dealing with exactly these kinds of demands and finding them harder to meet than expected. Her growing unease was exactly what I'd hoped to see. The crack in Sarah's facade came during a dinner party with her book club friends. I'd been invited to help serve, which gave me a perfect opportunity to observe her social performance. She was in full display mode, describing her renovation plans with theatrical enthusiasm. But when one of her friends mentioned having to cancel her own home improvements due to unexpected expenses, Sarah's response was too quick, too defensive. "Well, that's why you have to plan properly," she said with barely concealed anxiety. "Some people just don't think things through." The irony was lost on her, but not on her perceptive friend Lisa, who shot me a knowing look. Later, while helping me clear dishes, Lisa quietly asked if everything was all right with Sarah. She seemed stressed about something, more defensive than usual. I just smiled and changed the subject, but the seed was planted. Sarah's carefully maintained image of financial success was beginning to crack under the pressure of reality. Her friends were starting to notice the discrepancy between her confident words and her underlying anxiety. The perfect facade she'd worked so hard to maintain was developing visible flaws. For the next 2 weeks, I deliberately stepped back from any direct interaction with Sarah's renovation plans. I stopped asking questions, stopped offering opinions, and stopped showing any interest in her progress. This absence of attention was more unsettling to her than active opposition would have been. Sarah was accustomed to having an audience for her grand announcements. My sudden disinterest threw her off balance, making her wonder if I suspected something or was simply losing interest in her life. She began making more frequent visits, trying to draw me back into conversations about her plans. "Don't you want to see the latest designs for the master bathroom?" she asked with forced enthusiasm during one visit. When I responded with polite but distant interest, I could see her confusion. She was used to having her mother's attention, even if she'd previously taken it for granted. This strategic withdrawal was calculated to make her feel less secure, less certain of her position. By removing my predictable responses, I was forcing her to question her assumptions about our relationship and her ability to manipulate it. In the quiet of my garden, I took stock of what I was doing and why it mattered. Some might see my actions as petty revenge, but I knew better. This was about teaching accountability to someone who'd never learned it, about reclaiming dignity from someone who'd stolen it along with my money. I wasn't trying to destroy Sarah's life. I was trying to save it from the consequences of her own selfishness. She needed to understand that actions have repercussions, that other people's needs matter, and that the world didn't revolve around her desires. My retirement savings hadn't just been money, it had been security, independence, and the fruit of decades of careful planning. She'd stolen my peace of mind along with my financial future, treating my sacrifice as insignificant compared to her wants. If I did nothing, I'd be enabling her continued selfishness while accepting a diminished future for myself. But by teaching her consequences now, I might save her from bigger disasters later while reclaiming what was rightfully mine. This was about justice, not revenge. There was a crucial difference. After consulting with my lawyer brother Robert, I learned that I had more options than I'd initially realized. While Sarah was legally entitled to access the joint account, her use of the money for non-emergency purposes could be challenged, especially since she'd hidden the transaction from me. More importantly, Robert helped me understand Sarah's current financial vulnerabilities. She'd overextended herself based on the assumption that my savings would remain available as a safety net. By removing that net at the crucial moment, I could force her to confront the real cost of her choices. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would reclaim what remained of my financial independence while forcing Sarah to deal with the consequences of her reckless assumptions. She'd built her house of cards on the foundation of my money. It was time to remove that foundation and let her see how stable her construction really was. Robert helped me understand the legal protections available to me and the steps I could take to recover at least some of my stolen savings. The wheels were now in motion for a reckoning Sarah never saw coming. Sarah's desperation led her to make a crucial mistake. Unable to secure additional financing for her renovation overruns, she approached Richard for another loan from our joint retirement account. What she didn't know was that I'd already moved those funds into a new account with only my name on it. Richard came to me sheepishly, explaining Sarah's request. "She just needs another $20,000 to finish the project," he said, as if this was a reasonable request. "She promises to pay it all back once the house value goes up." This was the opening I'd been waiting for. "I'm sorry," I said calmly, "but that money is no longer available." Richard's confusion was immediate. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've secured our remaining retirement funds in a new account that only I can access," I explained matter-of-factly. "After what happened with my life savings, I felt it was necessary to protect what little we have left." The reality that there would be no more family money to pilfer hit Richard like a cold shower. For the first time, he began to understand the magnitude of what Sarah had done and the position it had left us in. Working with Robert, I began the process of recovering what I could from Sarah's theft. We discovered that because the money had been used for home improvements, There were legal avenues to place a lien against the property for the value of my stolen savings. The house she was so proudly renovating would now serve as collateral for my claim. I also quietly liquidated some smaller investments and consolidated my remaining resources into accounts that were solely mine. Every dollar Sarah had assumed would be available for her future emergencies was now beyond her reach. The most satisfying part was that I did all of this without alerting Sarah to what was happening. She was still operating under the assumption that her parents would continue to be her financial safety net, never imagining that the net was already gone. By the time she realized what had happened, the legal and financial structures would already be in place. Her house, purchased with my stolen money, would be security for her debt to me. The poetic justice was perfect. She'd used my money to trap herself. The first sign that Sarah was beginning to understand her situation came when she called, her voice tight with barely controlled stress. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important." She arrived at my house within the hour, her usual composure visibly cracking. "There's been some kind of mistake with our financing," she began, but I could see the truth in her eyes. She was starting to realize that her assumptions about available resources had been wrong. "The bank is asking for additional collateral for the construction loan," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "They're saying our debt-to-income ratio has changed. But that doesn't make sense." I listened with carefully practiced sympathy, knowing that her panic was just beginning. The banks were responding to the changes in her financial profile that my actions had triggered. Her house of cards was starting to sway, and she could feel the instability even if she didn't understand its source. "That does sound concerning," I agreed. "Financial institutions can be so unpredictable these days." I prepared for the inevitable confrontation with the calm of someone who had justice on their side. When Sarah finally discovered the extent of her changed circumstances, I wanted to be ready with facts, documentation, and unshakable moral authority. I gathered copies of all the bank statements showing my depleted life savings, Robert's legal assessment of my options, and documentation of every step I'd taken to protect what remained of my financial security. If Sarah wanted to argue about fairness, I'd have 30 years of careful saving to contrast with her impulsive theft. I also mentally prepared for her likely responses: anger, denial, attempts to blame me for not being more generous with family. I'd heard all these arguments before from people who confused entitlement with love, who believed that being family meant never having to face consequences. But I was no longer the passive mother who would absorb her selfishness without response. I'd reclaimed my agency, my dignity, and my financial independence. When Sarah finally realized what had happened, she'd be facing a very different woman than the one she'd stolen from. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning. Sarah stormed into my house without knocking, her face flushed with panic and rage. "What did you do?" she demanded, waving a stack of legal papers. "The bank is calling in our construction loan. They say our assets don't match our stated financial position." I set down my coffee cup with deliberate calm. "I protected myself from further theft," I said simply. "Theft?" Sarah's voice cracked on the word. "I'm your daughter." "Yes, and you stole my life savings without asking," I replied, my voice steady despite the years of hurt behind it. "You took my retirement security to fund your luxury renovations, then expected me to provide more money when you ran short." Sarah stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. The passive mother she'd taken for granted had been replaced by someone who would no longer enable her selfishness. "I was going to pay you back," she said weakly. "With what money?" I asked. "You're already overextended, and you've been counting on my continued financial support to cover your mistakes. That support is no longer available." The moment of realization was visible on her face. She finally understood that her actions had consequences. Richard arrived home to find Sarah in tears and me calmly explaining the situation. For the first time in our marriage, I watched my husband truly confront our daughter's behavior instead of enabling it. "She stole from us, Richard," I said firmly. "She took money we needed for our own security and used it to fund improvements to her house. Now she's discovered that actions have consequences." Robert arrived soon after with additional legal documentation, making it clear that this wasn't an emotional overreaction but a carefully considered response to theft. The presence of legal counsel forced both Richard and Sarah to confront the seriousness of what had happened. My sister Helen, who'd been quietly supporting me throughout this process, also came by to offer her witness to Sarah's desperate attempts to secure additional financing. The picture of systematic deception and entitlement became impossible to deny. For the first time, Sarah found herself without a family member willing to make excuses for her behavior. The united front of accountability was something she'd never faced before, and her attempts to deflect responsibility fell flat in the face of documented evidence. The full extent of Sarah's predicament became clear over the following days. Not only was she facing the loss of her construction loan, but the lien I'd placed on her house meant she couldn't sell or refinance without settling her debt to me first. Her dream renovation had become a financial nightmare that threatened her family's stability. Her book club friends began to whisper about the sudden halt in her renovation, the contractors leaving mid-project, and the obvious financial distress that she could no longer hide. The perfect image she'd worked so hard to maintain crumbled as quickly as her overextended finances. Marcus, finally understanding the full scope of their financial exposure, was furious with Sarah for making commitments without consulting him and for gambling their security on money that was never theirs. Their marriage faced new strains as the consequences of her choices rippled through every aspect of their lives. The daughter who'd been so confident about her financial acumen was revealed as reckless and entitled, someone who'd built her lifestyle on other people's sacrifice while contributing nothing herself. As I watched Sarah grapple with the consequences of her actions, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of revenge, but the deeper satisfaction of justice served and dignity reclaimed. I'd stood up for myself, protected my interests, and taught important lessons about respect and accountability. The money had been important, but what mattered more was proving to myself and my family that I wouldn't be dismissed, discounted, or taken advantage of. I was not a convenient resource to be exploited, but a person whose needs and security mattered. Sarah's crisis would eventually resolve. She'd learn to live within her means, make more careful decisions, and hopefully develop some appreciation for other people's sacrifices. But the relationship between us had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the passive mother who absorbed her selfishness without response. I'd rediscovered my strength, my voice, and my worth. No amount of money could have purchased that transformation. 6 months later, Sarah had sold her house to pay off the construction debt and settle her obligation to me. She and Marcus moved into a modest rental while they rebuilt their finances and their relationship. The experience had been humbling but ultimately educational. Sarah was slowly learning to appreciate what she had instead of constantly reaching for more. Richard, shaken by how close we'd come to losing our own security, became a more active partner in protecting our interests. He'd finally understood that enabling our daughter wasn't helping her, but hurting both her and us. I'd recovered most of my stolen savings and rebuilt my financial independence. More importantly, I'd established new boundaries that commanded respect from my family. I was no longer taken for granted, but appreciated for the strength and wisdom I'd always possessed. The garden where I'd first planned my response now felt like a place of victory rather than violation. I'd weathered the storm of betrayal and emerged stronger, more confident, and more secure. My later years would be spent on my own terms, with dignity intact and resources protected. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them face the consequences of their choices. Sarah had finally learned that lesson, and we were both better for it.